The fluorescent lights in the hospital hallway buzzed like they were trying to tell me something. I remember that sound more than anything else from that night. Not the sirens. Not the doctor's voice. Just that low, electric hum above my head while I sat in a plastic chair and watched my whole life fall apart. My name is Grace Bennett. I was 26 years old, and until 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in March, I had been a mother. Lily was 8. She had her father's dark curls and my stubborn chin and a laugh that could crack open the quietest room. For 2 years, we had fought leukemia together. 2 years of hospital beds, of IV drips that made her arms look like bruised watercolors, of promises I made in the dark that I wasn't sure God would let me keep. I told her every night that she was going to be okay. I told her we'd go back to the beach in Galveston, where she'd once found a sand dollar and held it up to the sun like she'd discovered treasure. I told her that her body was strong, that the medicine was working, that Mommy would never, ever let anything bad happen. I lied. The infection came fast. It wasn't the leukemia that took her, it was pneumonia, a secondary infection that swept through her weakened immune system like a wildfire through dry brush. One morning, she was sitting up in bed, coloring a picture of a house with a yellow door. By that evening, she was on a ventilator. By the next morning, she was gone. I don't remember screaming, but the nurses told me I did. I don't remember falling, but I woke up on the floor with someone's arms around me and Lily's hand still warm in mine. What I do remember is the doctor who came in an hour later. A woman in a white coat with kind eyes and a voice so gentle it almost made it worse. She told me that Lily's organs were healthy. That even though the infection had taken her lungs, her corneas, her liver, her kidneys were all viable. She said there were children on waiting lists. Children who would die without a transplant. She asked me if I would consider donating. I stared at her like she was speaking another language. My daughter's body was still warm in the bed beside me, and this woman was asking me to give pieces of her away. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to throw something. I wanted to say, how dare you ask me to carve up my baby girl when I haven't even had time to understand that she's gone. But then I looked at Lily. At her face, so peaceful it almost looked like she was sleeping. And I thought about all those nights I'd sat beside her bed, watching other children on the ward get sicker, watching their parents carry the same hollow terror in their eyes that I carried in mine. I thought about a mother somewhere, right now, sitting in a chair just like this one, praying for a miracle that might never come. I signed the papers at 4 a.m. My hand shook so badly that my signature looked like a seismograph reading. The nurse had to hold the clipboard steady. Before they took her, I unclasped the necklace from around Lily's neck. It was a thin silver chain with a small pendant shaped like a lily flower. I'd given it to her on her 6th birthday, the day before her first diagnosis. She never took it off. Not once. Not through chemo, not through radiation, not through any of it. She used to hold it between her fingers when the treatments got bad, rubbing the tiny petals like a worry stone. I pressed the pendant to my lips and whispered into her hair. You're going to save them, baby. You're going to save them because that's who you are. The bravest girl in the whole world. Then I asked the nurse for one more minute. Just one. I put the necklace back around Lily's neck. I don't know why. Maybe I thought whoever received her gifts should have something of who she was, not just her tissue and cells, but her. The nurse hesitated, then nodded. She wrote something on the chart, and I watched them wheel my daughter out of the room for the last time. I never saw the necklace again. 12 years. That's how long it takes for a wound to stop bleeding and start calcifying into something you carry in your bones. 12 years since that night in Houston, and I had rebuilt my life the way you rebuild a house after a flood. Slowly, poorly, with mismatched materials and gaps where the wind still gets through. My marriage didn't survive Lily. That's not unusual. The grief counselor told me that 60% of couples who lose a child end up separating. Daniel and I made it 14 months before the silence between us became louder than anything either of us could say. He moved to Denver. I stayed in Texas. We talked less and less until we didn't talk at all. No anger, no blame. Just two people who couldn't look at each other without seeing the ghost of the daughter they'd lost. I worked. That was my survival strategy. I took every shift I could get. I'd been a nurse before Lily got sick, but I couldn't go back to pediatrics. The sight of a child in a hospital bed would send me spiraling into a panic attack so severe I'd have to lock myself in the supply closet and breathe into a paper bag until my vision cleared. So I left medicine entirely. I waitressed for a while, then cleaned offices, then houses. It was mindless, physical work, and that was exactly what I needed. No children, no hospitals, no beeping monitors. Just sponges and spray bottles and the satisfying blankness of making dirty things clean. I was living in a studio apartment in Galveston. I'd moved there 3 years after Lily died, drawn by the memory of that sand dollar, of her face lit up against the Gulf. The apartment was small, just a bed, a kitchenette, and one window that looked out at a parking lot. But on the dresser by that window sat a framed photo of Lily holding up her sand dollar, grinning so wide you could count every missing tooth. And beside it, a small glass jar filled with shells we'd collected together. Those two things were my whole world. The cleaning agency I worked for, Gulf Coast Home Services, mostly sent me to vacation rentals and beachfront condos, tourists left behind sandy floors and sunburned sheets and the occasional forgotten flip-flop. The work was steady, but the pay was thin, and after my car broke down that December, the math stopped working. Insurance was due, rent was due. The mechanic wanted $800 I didn't have. I remember sitting on my bed with all the bills spread out in front of me like a losing hand of cards, doing the calculations over and over as if the numbers might change if I just tried hard enough. They didn't. That's when my supervisor called about the Ashford job. A private estate in Savannah, Georgia. A wealthy family needed a live-in housekeeper for 6 months while their regular staff was on leave. Room and board included, plus a salary that was nearly triple what I was making. I hesitated. I'd spent 12 years building walls around my life, keeping it small and manageable and safe. Moving to another state, into a stranger's home, felt like stepping off the edge of something. But the edge was already crumbling beneath my feet. I said yes. The Ashford estate sat at the end of a live oak corridor, the kind of driveway you see in movies about the Old South. Spanish moss hung from the branches like torn curtains, and the house itself rose from the manicured grounds like something out of another century. It was white-columned and wide-porched, and so immaculate it looked like no one had ever actually lived in it. I stood at the front gate with my suitcase and my canvas bag and felt approximately the size of an ant. The woman who opened the door was Margaret Ashford. Mid-50s, silver blonde hair pulled back in a low twist, wearing cream linen that probably cost more than my rent. She had the kind of beauty that comes with money and maintenance, and her eyes moved over me with the cool efficiency of someone inspecting a purchase. "You must be the replacement," she said, not a question. "Grace Bennett, ma'am." She stepped aside to let me in, and the foyer alone was bigger than my apartment. Marble floors, a staircase that curved upward like a ribbon, and a chandelier that threw little rainbows across the ceiling. "The house has 22 rooms," Margaret said, walking briskly ahead. "You will be responsible for all common areas and the family bedrooms. My husband, Thomas, is away on business most weeks. Our daughter, Claire, lives here as well. She's 20, an art student at SCAD. She keeps odd hours and is not to be disturbed when she's working." She paused and turned to face me. "I value discretion and efficiency. If something is beyond your capacity, tell me. What I cannot tolerate is carelessness." I nodded, swallowing the tightness in my throat. "Understood. One more thing," her voice dropped a fraction. "Claire has had health challenges her whole life. She's sensitive about it. Don't ask her questions about her medical history. Don't stare at her medication. Don't make her feel like a patient. She's had enough of that." The word patient hit me somewhere deep, but I kept my face still. "Of course, Mrs. Ashford." She gave me a brief nod, and I was dismissed to my quarters. A small, clean room off the kitchen with a window overlooking the garden. I unpacked in 15 minutes. Everything I owned fit in one suitcase and a canvas bag. That first week, I barely saw anyone. I cleaned. I polished. I scrubbed grout with a toothbrush and ironed tablecloths no one would use. Margaret checked my work once with a white glove. Literally, a white cotton glove run along the top of a door frame. She found dust on day 3 and told me about it with the same expression a surgeon might use to describe a complication. I cleaned it again. She didn't come back. It was on day 9 that I met Claire. I was vacuuming the upstairs hallway when a door opened and a young woman stepped out, barefoot, wearing paint-streaked overalls and a messy bun held together by what appeared to be a pencil. She had dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that were startlingly pale, almost silver in the hallway light. "Oh," she said, blinking at me, "you're new." "Grace," I said, turning off the vacuum. She smiled, and it changed her whole face, softened it, made her look younger. "I'm Claire. Sorry about the mess in my studio. I keep meaning to clean it, but then I start another painting, and suddenly it's 3 a.m. and I'm standing in a puddle of turquoise." I laughed before I could stop myself. It felt strange. I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed. "I don't mind messes," I said. "That's sort of the job." "Good," she said, grinning. "Because mine are legendary." Over the next few weeks, Claire and I fell into an easy rhythm. She was nothing like her mother. Where Margaret was controlled and precise, Claire was chaotic and warm. She left mugs of cold tea on every surface, hummed to herself while she painted, and talked to me like I was a person rather than a function. She asked about my life, my favorite movies, whether I'd been to the Savannah riverfront yet. I kept my answers light. I told her about Galveston, about the Gulf at sunrise, about the tourists who left half-eaten pizza in vacation rentals. I did not tell her about Lily. I did not tell her about the hospital, the necklace, the sound of a ventilator shutting off. That part of me was locked in a room I didn't open for anyone. But Claire made it hard to stay locked. She had this quality that I can only describe as gravitational. You wanted to orbit around her. You wanted to tell her things, not because she asked, but because her openness made your own walls feel unnecessary. One rainy afternoon, I brought her lunch in the studio because she'd missed it again. The room was a beautiful disaster. Canvases leaned against every wall. The smell of turpentine and oil paint hung in the air like fog. On the largest easel sat a painting that stopped me mid-step. It was a field of wildflowers under a sky so blue it ached. In the center of the field, a little girl stood with her back to the viewer, reaching towards something just out of frame. The colors were so vivid they seemed to vibrate. But it was the girl that got me. Something about the way she stood, one hand outstretched, the other clutching something small against her chest. "Who is she?" I asked before I could think. Claire looked up from her palette, brush in hand. "I don't know, honestly. She's been showing up in my paintings since I was a kid. Always the same girl, always in a field. My therapist says it's probably an expression of my inner child or something." She shrugged. "I just paint what I see." My chest tightened, but I told myself it meant nothing. Artists paint children. It didn't have to be a sign. Then Claire leaned forward to clean her brush, and her collar shifted, and I saw it. A thin silver chain around her neck. And hanging from it, catching the gray afternoon light through the studio window, a small pendant shaped like a flower. A lily. The tray slipped from my hands. The plate shattered on the hardwood floor, scattering pieces of sandwich and ceramic across the paint-spattered drop cloth. "Grace!" Claire jumped up. "Are you okay?" I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. My vision tunneled down to that pendant swinging gently against Claire's collarbone. It was the same. The same size, the same shape, the same slightly uneven petals where the jeweler had hand-pressed the silver. I knew it the way I knew my own heartbeat. I had clasped it around my daughter's neck 1,000 times. "I'm fine," I managed, dropping to my knees to pick up the broken pieces. "I'm sorry, I just slipped." Claire knelt beside me, helping gather the shards. The pendant dangled forward as she leaned, close enough to touch. I dug my nails into my palms to keep from reaching for it. "Hey," she said gently, studying my face. "You're shaking." "Low blood sugar," I lied. "I skipped breakfast." She didn't look convinced, but she let it go. Sit down, I'll get you some water. While she was gone, I pressed my back against the studio wall and covered my mouth with both hands to muffle the sound rising in my throat. It wasn't a scream, and it wasn't a sob. It was something in between, something that had been buried for 12 years and was now clawing its way to the surface with fingernails I couldn't cut. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and running through every possibility. It was a coincidence. Lots of necklaces look like that. Lily pendants aren't rare. Claire could have bought it anywhere. At a market. Online. From a catalog. There were 1,000 explanations that didn't involve the one thing I couldn't let myself believe. But my body knew something my mind refused to accept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Claire's hand reaching for the pendant the same way Lily used to, fingers finding it by instinct, rubbing the petals without thinking. And those paintings. The little girl in the field. The next morning, I went back to work. I dusted the library. I polished the silver tea set. I mopped the sunroom. And when I passed Claire's room on the way to collect the laundry, I paused. The door was open a crack. I could see the edge of her desk, scattered with sketchbooks and colored pencils. And on the desk, propped against a stack of art history textbooks, was a small framed photograph. It showed a much younger Claire, maybe 8 or 9, sitting in a hospital bed. She was thin, her eyes enormous in her small face. But she was smiling. And around her neck, clear as morning, was the lily pendant. My knees buckled. I caught myself on the doorframe. "You okay there?" a voice said behind me. I spun around. Standing in the hallway was a woman I'd seen around the estate, but never spoken to. She was in her 60s, sturdy and soft-eyed, wearing a gardener's apron and carrying a pair of pruning shears. Her name tag read, Ruth. "Fine," I whispered. "Just dizzy." Ruth studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said, "Come have tea with me." We sat in the small greenhouse behind the kitchen garden, surrounded by orchids and the smell of damp earth. Ruth poured 2 cups from a thermos and slid one across the potting bench. "You've been quiet since yesterday," she said. Not an accusation, an observation. "I'm always quiet. Not like this." She sipped her tea. "I've worked here for 14 years. I was here when Claire came home from the hospital the last time. I was here when she started painting. I've watched that girl grow up, and I know every person who walks through that door and how this house changes them." I said nothing. Ruth set her cup down. "I saw your face when you looked at Claire's necklace." My breath caught. "That pendant," Ruth continued, "came with her from the hospital. She was 8 years old and nearly blind. Degenerative condition. The doctors said she had maybe 6 months of sight left, and after that, total darkness. Her mother was out of her mind. Spent a fortune flying in specialists from everywhere, nothing worked. Then a donor match came through. Corneal transplant, both eyes." She paused, watching me. "The day after the surgery, when they took the bandages off and Claire could see, the hospital gave the family a box. They said it was from the donor's mother. Inside was a silver necklace with a lily pendant and a note. Just one line. I closed my eyes. I knew what it said. I had written it. So she can see the flowers." The greenhouse went silent except for the drip of condensation off the glass roof. "That was you," Ruth said softly. "Wasn't it?" I couldn't answer. My hands were pressed flat on the bench, and tears were running down my face into the wood grain. "I recognized you the first day," Ruth said. "Not your face, your hands. The way you hold things, careful, like everything might break. Claire does the same thing. I always wondered where she got it." She reached across the bench and covered my hand with hers. "Your daughter gave Claire the world," Ruth whispered. "Every painting she makes, every sunrise she watches, every face she sees, that's your girl's gift." I broke completely and thoroughly, right there among the orchids, with this woman I barely knew holding my hand while 12 years of locked-away grief poured out of me in waves that shook my whole body. I cried for Lily. I cried for the necklace I'd placed back around her neck, not knowing where it would end up. I cried because my daughter's eyes were alive in this house, seeing colors and light and the faces of people who loved her, and I hadn't known. For 12 years, I hadn't known. When the sobs finally eased, Ruth handed me a napkin and said nothing for a while. Then she spoke again. Claire has dreams. Has since she was small. She told me once that she sees a woman in her dreams. Dark hair, standing on a beach, holding a little girl's hand. They're looking for something in the sand. Claire said the woman always looks happy and sad at the same time. Galveston. The sand dollar. My daughter's hand in mine. I pressed the napkin to my mouth and shook my head. I can't tell her. I can't put this on her. Ruth squeezed my hand. That's not my decision to make. But I'll tell you this. That girl has spent her whole life wondering about the person who gave her sight. She talks about it sometimes, late at night, when she can't sleep. She calls them her light giver. She says she hopes, wherever they are, they know she's using the gift well. The days that followed were the hardest of my time in that house. Harder, in some ways, than the grief I'd carried before. Because now the grief had a living face. It looked at me over breakfast. It hummed while it painted. It wore my daughter's necklace and held a brush with the steady hand that my daughter's corneas had made possible. I tried to keep my distance. Margaret had made the rules clear, and I told myself I was just the housekeeper, that this wasn't my world to enter. But Claire kept pulling me in. Grace, come look at this. She'd wave me into the studio to see a new canvas. Grace, taste this. She'd hand me a spoon from whatever she was cooking at midnight. Grace, sit with me. She'd pat the porch swing and tell me about her classes, her professors, the gallery show she was preparing for. And I kept noticing things. The way she tilted her head when she listened, just slightly to the left, the way Lily used to. The way she squinted at bright light, still adjusting after all these years to a visual acuity she hadn't been born with. The way she touched the lily pendant when she was thinking, rolling it between her fingers exactly the way my daughter had done in her hospital bed. One evening, I found Claire on the back porch, knees pulled to her chest, staring out at the garden. The sun was setting behind the live oaks, turning everything amber and gold. She looked up when she heard me. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. I sat down beside her. "Sure. Have you ever lost someone? I mean, really lost them. Not a breakup or a friend who moved away. Someone who was just there one day and gone the next." My throat closed. Yes. Who? I hesitated for so long that the silence became its own answer. Claire didn't push. She just sat there, waiting, and her patience undid me. "My daughter," I said. The words came out barely louder than a breath. "She died when she was 8. Claire's hand found mine. She didn't say she was sorry, she didn't say it would get better. She just held on, her fingers warm and steady, and let the silence hold what words couldn't. "Her name was Lily," I whispered. Claire went very still. I felt her grip tighten around my hand. "Lily," she repeated, and her other hand drifted up to touch the pendant at her throat. We sat there as the last of the daylight drained from the sky, and I knew, watching her fingers trace the shape of that tiny silver flower, that the truth was already growing between us, like a vine neither of us could stop. It was Margaret who shattered everything. Not intentionally, not cruelly, but with the precise, devastating efficiency that seemed to define everything she did. She found me in the laundry room on a Thursday morning, her face rigid, her hands clasped in front of her like a woman preparing to deliver a verdict. "I need to speak with you," she said. "About Claire." My stomach dropped. "Yes, ma'am?" "Ruth told me she's been confiding in you, telling you personal things." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I want to be clear. You are here to maintain this house, not to become part of my daughter's life. Claire is fragile. She has been through more than you can imagine, and the last thing she needs is an attachment to someone who will be gone in 4 months. The words landed like slaps, but I didn't flinch. Because beneath Margaret's ice, I heard something I recognized. The voice of a mother who had sat in a hospital room and bargained with God. A mother who had built walls so high around her child that she'd forgotten what the world looked like from inside them. "I understand," I said quietly. Good. She turned to leave, then stopped. And whatever you think you know about my daughter's medical history, I'd advise you to forget it. That part of her life is private. It belongs to this family. She left, and I stood in the laundry room with my hands braced on the folding table, breathing slowly through my nose. She was protecting Claire. I understood that. But the thing she was protecting Claire from was me, and the thing she didn't know was that the gift inside her daughter's eyes had come from mine. That night, I almost called Daniel. I picked up the phone and stared at his number for 20 minutes. We hadn't spoken in 3 years. What would I even say? I found her. I found where Lily's eyes went. They're beautiful, she's beautiful. She paints wildflowers, and she wears the necklace, and she dreams about us on the beach. I put the phone down. Some things you have to carry alone until you can't anymore. The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon. Claire had invited me to see her work for the SCAD gallery show. She'd spent weeks preparing, and the studio was arranged with a dozen canvases set up along the walls. She walked me through each one, explaining the inspiration, the technique, the palette choices. The last painting was the largest. It hung on the back wall of the studio, and when Claire pulled the cloth away, the room seemed to change temperature. It was a woman kneeling on a beach, holding a small child. The ocean stretched out behind them, endless and blue. The child was reaching up, pressing something into the woman's hands. A shell. $1. The colors were so luminous, they seemed to glow from inside the canvas. I don't know where this one came from, Claire said, her voice hushed. I painted it in one night. I couldn't stop. It was like something was moving through me, like the painting already existed, and I was just the one holding the brush. I stood in front of it and felt the world tilt sideways. It was us. It was Lily and me on the beach in Galveston, the day she found the sand dollar. Claire had never seen a photo of that day. She had never been to Galveston. She had no way of knowing what my daughter looked like, or what I looked like 12 years ago, or that there had ever been a sand dollar held up to the sun by small, triumphant hands. But she had painted it. Every detail. The angle of the light, the curl of the waves, the way my daughter's hair blew sideways in the Gulf wind. She had painted a memory that didn't belong to her. Or maybe it did. Grace? Claire's voice came from far away. You're crying. I was crying so hard I couldn't see. I sank onto the studio floor, my back against the wall, and the sobs came from somewhere deeper than my chest, somewhere primal, somewhere that had been holding its breath for 12 years and finally let go. Claire knelt in front of me, her hands on my shoulders, her face creased with worry. Grace, what's wrong? What did I do? Nothing, I gasped. You didn't do anything wrong. You did something beautiful. You did the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. She stared at me, confused and scared, and I knew I couldn't hold it anymore. The walls I'd built, the silence I'd maintained, the careful distance I'd kept from the truth. It all came down in that moment, like a dam giving way. The girl in your paintings, I said, my voice shaking. The one you've been seeing your whole life. Her name was Lily. And she was my daughter. Claire's face went white, her hands dropped from my shoulders. 12 years ago, she died from an infection during leukemia treatment. She was 8 years old. Before they took her, I signed the papers to donate her organs. Her corneas went to a girl her age. A girl who was going blind. I looked at Claire through my tears. That girl was you. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Claire's hand moved slowly to the pendant at her throat. The necklace, she whispered. The hospital said it came from the donor's mother. There was a note. So she can see the flowers. Claire made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She looked at the painting on the wall, the woman on the beach, the child with the sand dollar, and then she looked back at me. I see them, she breathed. I see the flowers. Every day. Every single day, I see them. She pressed her palms to her eyes, tears streaming between her fingers. Is that her? Is she the one I dream about? Yes. And the beach? The shells? The woman who's always happy and sad at the same time? That's us, that's me and Lily. In Galveston. Claire threw her arms around me and held on with a ferocity that shook us both. We knelt on the paint-stained studio floor and cried into each other's shoulders, two strangers bound together by a gift that had crossed the boundary between death and life, between loss and creation, between a mother's last act of love and a young woman's first act of sight. When we finally pulled apart, Claire held my face in both her hands and looked at me with those pale silver eyes that I now knew had once been dark and failing. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for letting her save me." "She didn't just save you," I whispered. "She became part of you. Every painting. Every color. That's her, too," Claire told Margaret that evening. I stood in the hallway outside the living room and listened, not because I wanted to eavesdrop, but because my legs wouldn't carry me past the door. I heard Claire's voice, steady and measured, explaining what she'd learned. I heard the long silence that followed. And then I heard a sound I never expected to hear from Margaret Ashford. "Aesop." The living room door opened, and Margaret stood there, her face stripped of every layer of composure she'd ever built. No ice, no distance. Just a mother standing in the wreckage of a secret she'd guarded for 12 years. "I knew," she said, her voice breaking. "I knew the donor was a little girl. They told us when Claire was in recovery. An 8-year-old. Leukemia. I asked them not to give us the family's name because I was afraid. Afraid that if I knew who she was, I'd have to face what it cost someone else for my daughter to see." She covered her mouth with a trembling hand. "I've carried that guilt every day of my life." I crossed the hallway and stood in front of her. This woman who had treated me like a servant. Who had told me I didn't belong in her daughter's world. Who had built her walls just as high as mine, just in the opposite direction. "There's nothing to feel guilty about," I said. "My daughter died whether or not you accepted her gift. But because you did, because you said yes, she's still here. She's in every painting Claire makes. She's in every sunrise Claire sees. You didn't take anything from me, you gave Lily a future I couldn't." Margaret's knees gave out. I caught her, and we sank together onto the floor of the hallway, holding each other the way only mothers can. Mothers who understand that love doesn't end when a child dies. It just changes shape. Thomas Ashford came home that weekend. He was a tall, quiet man with reading glasses and gentle hands, and when Claire told him the story, he sat very still for a long time. Then he stood up, walked across the room, and embraced me without saying a word. Sometimes there are no words. Sometimes the silence says it all. Over the weeks that followed, the house transformed. Not physically, the marble and chandeliers and live oaks stayed the same. But the air inside it changed. Margaret stopped checking my work. She started bringing me coffee in the morning, sitting at the kitchen island and asking me to tell her about Lily. What was she like? What made her laugh? What was her favorite color? "Yellow," I told her. She said it was the color of happy. Margaret smiled, and it was the first real smile I'd ever seen on her face. Claire and I spent hours together. I told her everything. The pirate books Lily read under the covers. The sand dollar collection. Her fear of thunderstorms and her belief that if you wished hard enough on a dandelion, it would come true. Claire listened, like she was collecting pieces of a puzzle she'd been assembling her whole life. "I think I've always known," she said one afternoon, touching the pendant. "Not the facts, not the names. But something deeper. Like a memory that wasn't mine but still lived inside me." "Maybe it does," I said. Claire's gallery show opened in May. The centerpiece was the beach painting, the one of me and Lily and the sand dollar. She titled it The Light Giver. The artist's statement beside it read, "For the girl who gave me sight, and the mother who gave me the world." I stood in that gallery surrounded by strangers in nice clothes and watched people stop in front of my daughter's memory and weep. A woman I'd never met pressed my hand and said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. A man with a beard told me he was going to register as an organ donor that night. Thomas and Margaret established the Lily Bennett Arts Foundation that summer, dedicated to funding art education for children with visual impairments. Claire designed the logo herself, a lily flower inside an open eye. They offered to pay off my debts. I refused 3 times before Margaret sat me down and said, "Grace, you gave us our daughter's sight, let us give you some peace." I cried and nodded, and felt something shift inside me, like a bone that had been set wrong for years, finally clicking into place. I stayed in Savannah. Not as the housekeeper. Margaret converted the guest cottage at the edge of the estate into a small home for me, with a porch that overlooked the garden and a window where the morning light came in gold. Claire hung one of her paintings on my wall, a field of wildflowers under an impossible sky, and said, "These are for you, from both of us." On what would have been Lily's 20th birthday, Claire and I drove to Galveston. We stood on the beach where it all began, shoes off, the Gulf wind tangling our hair. Claire held the lily pendant in one hand and a fresh sand dollar in the other. "I found it," she said, grinning with the same wide-open joy that I'd seen on my daughter's face in that photograph on my dresser. I looked at her, this young woman who carried my daughter's sight in her eyes and my daughter's necklace at her throat, and my daughter's memory in paintings that made strangers cry. And I understood something I hadn't been able to grasp for 12 years. Lily hadn't left me, she had multiplied. She was in Claire's eyes, in every color Claire mixed on her palette, in every child who would learn to paint through the foundation that bore her name. She was in the flowers Claire saw and the dreams Claire dreamed and the light that poured through the studio window every morning. She was not gone. She was everywhere. Claire reached for my hand, and we stood together at the edge of the water, 2 women who had found each other across an impossible distance, connected by a gift that death could not diminish and time could not erase. The waves came in and went out, steady as a heartbeat. Somewhere, a pelican dove into the surf. Somewhere, a child laughed. I closed my eyes and felt the sun on my face and Lily's hand in mine, not the ghost of it, not the memory, but the living warmth of a love that had changed shape but never, not for one single moment, stopped.